Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin, daf samchet. We are going to start the fourth chapter. So our fourth chapter starts with an understanding that kind of everyone knows this, that there's a din called ben pikuah. What is that law? It means that if you slaughter an animal and the animal is pregnant and inside there's an embryo of an unborn animal, as soon as you slaughter the mother, the ubar, the embryo, is permitted. Okay, so that animal, say it's a fully, we'll talk about the fully grown, that's going to be another thing later, but let's say, right, it's an animal. At that point, the animal, let's say, dies during childbirth, during the slaughter, or let's say doesn't die and lives. Well, a fascinating halacha, you do not need to slaughter that fetus, okay, that embryo. It's completely, the animal now that comes out, you could just stab it and eat it, okay? Because it was already permitted in the shechita of its mother. It's considered part of the mother's body, and which we've seen before, this whole issue is ubar yerechimo, is just like a part of the mother's body, and already was permitted to eat. And that comes from a pasuk in kashrut, which we're going to darshan a bunch today. Kol behema mefreset parsa, v'shosat shesa shtei praso. Right, this is the signs of a kosher animal in Sefer Devarim, chapter 14. Malake rabbe behema otatochelu. So it starts off as saying all animals, and then it ends with saying the word animal again. Be behema, in an animal, can be eaten. Okay, now obviously there's words in between. There's reason for those words, but you ignore the whole middle of the pasuk. You can read it like this: Kol behema bi behema tochelu. Any animal in another animal can be eaten. And they say, oh look, that's how you read it. That means that the fetus can be eaten. Okay, so now that's a big halacha. Our Mishna starts off with assuming that's going on, and we have a case of a behema hamakasha leled. Okay, we have an animal that's struggling during childbirth. Okay, now, why this is the case, it's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be that that's the case, and I'll read one more line and then I'll go back and explain then why does it specifically bring that case. V'hotzi ha'ubar et yado v'hichzira. If the embryo inside, the animal inside, basically puts its arm out while the mother is struggling in childbirth, and then brings it back inside. So the arm went out of the womb and back into the womb. Mutar ba'achila. It is permitted to be eaten. Now I specifically say it without explaining what it is. Do we mean the limb that went out and back in? The leg, we'll call it yado, is technically leg here. Or do we mean the whole animal inside, the fetus, is permitted? Okay? Now, why is it a behema maksha leled? So the commentaries basically say, because this halacha, which we don't really understand yet, okay, again, let's just say what we do understand. A limb went out, a limb came back in, okay? And while they slaughtered the mother, now you have to understand, the fact that the mother was struggling in childbirth is perhaps why they decided to slaughter the animal, because if they lose the animal dies in childbirth, well then it's a nevela, and they don't want to end up with a nevela. So they immediately decide we're going to slaughter the animal. Now, the idea of the behema maksha leled, the commentaries basically say it's not, it could be even if she wasn't. Even if the main point is, while you're slaughtering the mother, if the ubar puts out its arm and puts its leg and puts it back in, then it's permitted to eat. Okay? The maksha leled is either just a common case, well, let's put it this way. Either which way we say it, it's probably just a common case where this would happen. Where what would happen? Well, either that was the common case where they would slaughter animals because as it was giving birth and struggling and you didn't want the animal to die, so you said, let me just quickly slaughter it before it dies on its own. Or maybe that explains why this ubar, why this animal inside, the baby, put out its limb. Maybe that was part of the struggle in the childbirth, okay? Because maybe it's hard to understand why else the limb would have gone out and back in. And maybe the going out and back in had something to do, I don't know what exactly, with the mother struggling in childbirth. Okay, that's a very side point. I want to focus on the main point, which is, we have this line that says, once the ubar puts out its limb, puts it back in, it sounds like it doesn't make a difference. It's still all permitted. Now, what's permitted? There's two options, and this is going to be today's sugya completely. The two options of reading it. One is the leg that went out is still considered having been inside, wasn't considered like it was already out because it went out temporarily, but went back in. So because it's back in at the time that we slaughter the mother, it's part of what's permitted. And obviously the whole rest of the animal is permitted. According to a different interpretation, what is permitted? The rest of the animal, of the baby, but not the limb that went out. Okay, that's going to be the first opinion we see and that we deal with most of today's stuff. Okay, so as we go on in the Mishnah, you can think about which one to you seems more intuitive. Okay, Hotzi et rosho. The next part in the Mishnah is, what if it put its head out? Now, the head is considered an important part of the animal. So once it puts its head out, even if the head goes back in the womb, and it's there when they slaughter the animal, the mother, doesn't matter. It's as if the animal was born, and the whole law of ben pekuat sounds like doesn't apply at all. Okay? Sounds like, right now, it's as if it was born and nothing's permitted. And that's even if it went back inside. Chotech meubar shebeme'eha. What if, this is a different case, within this case, what if you cut a limb of the animal within the womb, okay, of the baby, and you cut it, like one of the limbs, but you leave it, so it's detached from the fetus, and now, what do? You leave it inside the bigger animal. Okay, so you didn't take it out completely. It never left, right? The first part of the Mishnah was talking about it left the airspace of the womb. This time you left it in the womb, okay, the piece that you cut off. Mutar ba'achila. Fascinating. It's detached from the fetus, but it doesn't matter because it's still in the womb, and whatever's in the womb gets basically covered by the slaughter of the mother. But what if you cut a part of, now, we know there's a law called Ever Min HaChai, a limb of a live animal. So let's say before you slaughter the mother, okay, the cow we'll call it, before you slaughter the cow, you cut a part of its body, either, let's say, from the spleen, min ha'tchol, umin ha'klayot, or from the kidneys. Now, they specifically choose these examples. Why? Remember the difference between them and the lungs and the heart? Because they're considered less critical. Remember we said if the tchol is taken out, right, or the liver, as long as you leave a little part of it, right, these are a little bit less significant, even though they're pretty significant parts of the body. If you cut them, but left them inside, you didn't take them out, so it's not exactly Ever Min HaChai, okay, but it kind of is, because you cut the limb off while the animal was still alive, asur ba'achila. Okay, this is going to be forbidden. When you slaughter the animal, that's not permitted. They want to make a distinction here, and that's going to be the rule they're going to say right now. Zeh hakla. Davar shegufa asur v'she'ena gufa mutal. Something that is considered part of the body of the animal is going to be forbidden if it's cut off. It's not going to be covered by the slaughter. But if it's not part of its body, like the fetus, then anything that's considered part of the fetus, even if it's detached from the fetus, is going to be covered. It doesn't have to be connected. Okay? So that's exactly, that's exactly the second part of this Mishnah, that we're differentiating between what's the animal's body itself and what's part of the not part of the animal's body, which we call now, right? We're talking about the fetus, which is not part of the animal, which is covered by the slaughter anyway. Well, it's going to include anything that's in there in the womb, even though it might be detached. Okay, that part we're going to deal with later. Today we're going to deal with the first part of the Gemara, and yes, this is based on this concept that the fetus is part of the body, and that's why it's permitted. Yes, Tina. The fetus is, well, there's a machloket about this, whether ubar yerech imo or not yerech imo. Now, everybody thinks that the ben pekuah is a law, whether you say it's yerech imo or not yerech imo, and that's why I didn't want to start getting into it. But yes, there is this concept that the ubar is considered just like the fetus is a part of the mother's body, okay? And therefore, it's going to be, right, and that's, once you slaughter the mother, this is kind of part of it. Or if you say it's not, then this is a special law, okay? You have to look at it in two possible ways. Okay, now I want to start with the Gemara. And the main part of our daf is going to be Rav's approach. The way I'm going to talk about the structure of the daf, because it's going to be one of those dafim where we're going to have questions and answers and difficulties on the answers, and but a lot of back and forth. So I want to keep you focused also into what's the structure here so you don't get confused. We're going to basically bring 3 tannaitic sources to raise the difficulty on this Shita of Rav that we're going to read right now. Okay, and the first one is going to be the language of our Mishnah. Okay, so the first thing we have is Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav, Ever atzmo asul. Okay, the limb itself is forbidden. Meaning, if the limb went out and the limb went back in, you cannot eat that limb. The limb is not protected right? Not covered by the shechita of the mother, and obviously you can't slaughter a limb, so it can never be eaten. That's what he says. My timer, what's his proof? And now we're going to have his proof, and then we're going to start with the 3 difficulties. My timer, the pasuk says. Okay, now this is the pasuk in Sefer Shemot, chapter 22. Okay, the pasuk before basically is the pasuk that says, if you an animal gives birth to an offspring, you have to wait till 8 days. Once the child's 8 days old, you can already use it for a sacrifice. The context seems to be sacrifices. The beginning of the pasuk is Anshe Kodesh Yun Li, be holy people to me. Ubasar b'sadeh treifa lo tochelu lakelev tishlichunoto. Don't eat treifa meat in a field. Give it to a dog. What does that have to do with anything here? Excellent question. What does this pasuk have to do in general? Because the pasuk says meat in a field that's treifa. Now, meat anywhere is treifa, not just in a field. Meat anywhere that's treifa you can't eat. So why does it say field? And what does this have to do with sanctified meat? Because that seemed to be the context. So the way Rav darshans this is, Kevan shiatza basal chutz lemechitzato ne'esal. What does this say? What does it mean, basadeh? Basadeh means outside. Outside what? Well, when we talk about sacrifices, there's inside, there's outside. What does that mean? Sacrifices have a place, sacrificial meat, where they can be eaten. They can be eaten if they're high-level sanctity. This goes back to Zvachim, good review. High-level sanctity like chatat and asham and those are eaten in the walls of the Azarah, in the temple courtyard. You take them out. Now, this is what they're going to talk about. If you take it out, if you by accident take that meat out of the temple courtyard and bring it back in, tough luck. You can't eat it. That's what it means, basal b'sadeh treifa. If you take it out to the fields, it doesn't have to be out in the fields. It just means to an outside place where it's not supposed to be. Okay, or for example, shlamim has to be eaten in Jerusalem. If you take it out of the walls of Jerusalem and bring it back in, completely disqualified. It doesn't help you. You can't eat it once you bring it back in. Now, what does this have to do with our case? Take that one step farther. You have a fetus that's supposed to be inside, and when it's inside, it's covered by the mother's slaughter. If the fetus puts its leg out and brings it back in, it's too late. It went out of where it was supposed to be, and it's no longer considered part of the body of the animal, of the fetus. So now it's going to be forbidden, okay? Meaning it's not covered by the slaughter, which means it can never be eaten. And that's where he gets it from, okay? It's a very interesting proof, right? It's really out there, but that's his proof. So now we're going to start with our difficulties. Difficulty number 1. Okay, what's interesting about this, I'll warn you, okay? It gets a lot off, like I told you before. There's going to be an answer. There's going to be a difficulty on that. We're going to have like an answer to that, and then we're going to have a difficulty on that answer, and then we're going to have another. In the end, though, all 3 questions we're going to have, in the end, the bottom line answer is the same for all 3. So while it might get complicated, just to remind you, the basic structure is we're going to bring a tannaitic source that can't really be read like Rav, and then we're going to somehow explain how it is, and each one bottom line will be, the answer is the same in all 3. Okay, so that's at least to make it a little easier to get. Tanan. Behema maksha leled v'hotzia ubarat yado v'chzira mutar b'achila. Now, the simple way of reading this is, okay, and we'll see why that's the simple way, even though I kind of read it and I didn't really want to say what it meant because it's already open to interpretation. But let's look at our Mishnah. So Rav just says that any limb that goes out is going to be forbidden. But look at the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, if the behemah is having trouble giving birth, during childbirth, or during birth, and the ubar, the fetus, puts out its leg and brings it back in, it's permitted to eat. Now, what's permitted to eat? My lava aver, it seems to sound like the limb. Okay, in a minute you'll see why they assume that. To which they say, and then that means the limb is permitted against Rav, who said the limb is forbidden. Lo, a'ubal. No, you could say it's talking about the fetus. Okay? The whole fetus is permitted other than the limb. Okay? To which the Gemara is going to say, this is all part of the first question, Ia ubal my iria hechziru, afilu lo hechzira nami. So this is really, okay, this is the difficulty on this answer, which is what? If it's the fetus, then read the Mishnah like this. If the fetus puts out its limb and brings it back in, then the fetus will be permitted. But it sounds like if the leg was left out during the time of the slaughter, then what would you say? If it lo ichzira, didn't bring it in, then the fetus is not permitted. And that's simply not true. The fetus is permitted no matter what. The question is about the limb. And then if the limb was inside, it would be covered. If the limb was outside, it wouldn't be covered. So, why does it say ichzira? Ichzira seems to imply only if you brought it in. Afilu lo ichzira nami, but we all know the halacha, and Rav would even say this, even if the limb isn't brought in and the limb is left outside, for sure the fetus is permitted, just not the limb. So how can Rav say, right, this whole word hichzira makes no sense. So if we read the Mishnah as mutar b'achila, mutar the fetus, well, it doesn't work because of the word hichzira, which seems to imply only if you returned it. So the Gemara is going to say, hu adin. Okay, this is the first answer. Hu adin for this difficulty. Okay, this difficulty is going to have two answers. We're going to ultimately reject the first one, and then we'll have the second one. Hu adin af agav de lo hichzira. It's true even if you don't bring it back in. Okay, don't take that word too seriously. Don't say only if hichzira, the fetus is going to be permitted. The fetus is permitted even if you didn't return it. Okay, well now we have to obviously explain why did they use that word then? Well, de kabai mitna seifa. It's really because of the second line. So oftentimes we have words in tannaitic sources that don't mean that only that, but they use that language to compare it to the second as a foil. Okay, why? Because what's the seifa? Hutziet rosho, af al pi shechziro harezek ki yalod. Now here you understand why hechzira is important. If the head went out, even if the head goes back in, it's as if the fetus was completely born. Now that is specifically, even though you brought it in, right? That's the chidush of that line. Because obviously if it was out, it would be more easy to say that obviously, right, the fetus is going to be forbidden because it's not going to be covered by the shechita. But if it went back in, it's still considered as if it was born. So now you have the entire fetus inside while you slaughter the animal. It's not going to cover it. That's the chidush of that line. And there you needed hechzira. So because you need tannaitic, because of that, tannaitic reisha hechzira. So therefore hechzira was put into the front, the first case, just to compare it to the second. But obviously the first case is whether you returned it or whether you didn't return it, either which way the fetus is permitted. Okay, that's the answer. And that sounds like a very good answer, even though, okay, maybe it's not completely satisfactory, but we basically say don't take that word too seriously in the first line. It was only there on account of the second line. But now we're going to completely reject this because what are they saying? They're going to basically, their theory is, I don't need you to tell me that a head going out is like the animal is born and the fetus will be completely forbidden, right? Won't be permitted by the slaughter of the mother, which means basically in this case, what would you do? Well, you'd have to slaughter the fetus once it's born, right? Then later on, when you're ready to slaughter it, it needs kosher slaughter rather than the ben pekuah halacha. But basically they're going to say, we have another Mishnah that tells you that once the head goes out, it's like it's born. So I don't need this Mishnah to tell me in this particular halacha because I could have learned it from somewhere else. And then they're going to say the chzira in the second part is completely unnecessary, which then puts us back to our question. Well, then chzira must be there on purpose in the reisha, and then that doesn't fit with Rav. So let's read. V'seifa mai kamashlan. Wait. So what? This is just repeating what we said, which is what do you want to teach us from the seifa then? Dekevan diatzar rosho havya leida. Right. That you want to basically say, since the head went out, even though it went back in, it's still considered like the fetus was born. But Tanina, but there's a Mishnah already that says it. A Mishnah in Bechorot. What does the Mishnah say? It's like a riddle. Where is a case where you have a firstborn for inheriting, you get the double portion, but you're not going to be a firstborn that you need redemption by, right, a pidyon ben. Okay? You're not going to need that. What's the case? So there's two cases. The second one is the relevant one for us, not the first, but we're going to learn it anyway. There's a bunch of things we have to learn today that are just part of sources, so we're going to learn them anyway. Haba achar nefalim. You might remember there's 8-month babies, right? There's babies born either 7th and 9th month. 7th is a premature, 9th month is a full term, and those are viable babies. They believed in the time of the Gemara that 8-month babies would never make it. If you were born in the 8th month, that meant you were never going to make it. That's called a nefel. So if you're ba'achar nefalim, if basically, let's say, Rashi says the case is there's twins inside, and we have one who was born in the 8th month, okay, put his head out, even though the head went out, and the baby, this by the way is humans, right? The baby was still alive, okay, even though it wasn't a viable baby, okay, because it wasn't going to make it, even though the head came out first, and then let's say went back in, and then eventually the 9-month came out in the right time. So that will be a case where the 9-month-old, right, the one born properly, is the firstborn for Nachala, because the 8th month was never really a real birth, but it was enough of a birth to say it's not a Pidyon Ben. Why? Because the head went out. So even though it was, right, a Nefel, but it was as if the head went out, and it's not going to be, the Pidyon Ben is not going to go on that 9-month-old. And it won't, the one born to 9 months, it won't go on the 8th month because that one never made it. Oh, ben tish'ash yatzaro shomet. Or what if we had a situation with twins where one of them didn't make it, but the one that didn't make it, his head went out of the womb when it was dead, okay? Then also you're going to have a situation where it's the one who actually is born and lives is a firstborn for Nachala, but not a firstborn for Kihuna, okay? It's not considered, it doesn't need a Pidyon Ben, a redemption there, because again, the 9-month one that came out that survived was not the first one to come out. So when the head comes out, even when the animal's dead, right, we see that. Now, because the animal was dead, now this is the key, okay? Tama derosho met. Okay, now, but for Nachala purposes, for Pishnayim, for getting a double portion, in that case, the firstborn is really going to be a firstborn, even though they're not a firstborn for Kiuna, because this other, the twin put out its head even when it was dead, but that was considered a birth. But it is a Bechor for firstborn, for a double portion. But now they're going to say the following. Notice, specifically in the second case, it said, when it put its head out when it was dead. What if the 9-month didn't survive, but did put out its head when it was still alive? Okay, now they're going to say, specifically they said here, Tama de Roshomet, because it was dead at the time it put its head out, that's why the second one, which ends up being really born and is born first, ends up the Bechor for Nachala. But Haroshochai, you can make this inference, if the head went out when the baby was still alive, Haba Chara Bechor LaNachala Nami Lo Havi. The second one is not really considered born. Why? This is exactly what we were looking for. Because when the baby is full term, okay, meaning it was born in the right time and it could have survived but didn't, put out its head when it was still alive, put it back in, that's as if it was born first. So even though that twin doesn't ever make it, that twin was the firstborn. And this second one is always going to be considered the second one. And will not get anything, right? And there's no Pidyon Ben, and there's also no double portion. So, what do you see here? In simple terms, without getting into all the details again, this Mishnah teaches you what we thought our Mishnah was teaching us. We thought the whole Chiddush of the Mishnah, the reason why it said Hechziro in the first line, was because we needed Hechziro in the second line. When it brings its arm back in, right? Or when it brings its head back in, it doesn't matter. It was already completely born, just like we just learned in this Mishnah. So we don't need two Mishnahs to teach us the same thing, in which case the Chzira in the second part is really unnecessary. And then that's going to take us back to, well, then what's it doing there in the first line, okay? And it doesn't really work according to Rav, but we're not there yet. So now they say, wait a minute. Don't reject this immediately, because V'chi Tema, now, what's the big difference between the two Mishnayot? Our Mishnah is talking about an animal, and that Mishnah was talking about a human. Maybe there's a difference in the head, right? And maybe you wouldn't have been able to learn one from the other, that the head going out is considered as if it was born. Maybe you'd think it's only in humans and not in animals, or maybe you think it's only in animals and not in humans, and that's why you need both Mishnayot. And then we're back to saying, that's why the Sefer says Hechzira, and the Reisha says it only to match the Sefer. Okay, right? The first part is just to get it to the second part. And then we'd be okay. So let's see. But they're introducing it with V'chi Tema, which means we're going to reject it. If you want to say, Ashmi'inam be'adam, be'kamash malam be'be'ema, da'adami be'ema lo yalif, and as maybe it's true they taught it in Bechorot with humans, but they had to also teach it with animals because Adam Be'ema lo Yalif, because you couldn't have learned Adam from Be'ema. Why? We're now going to say why you couldn't have learned in either direction. You couldn't have learned the case of Bechor from our Mishnah. Why? To aim prosdor le Be'ema. This is a very interesting explanation. They say in an animal there's no canal. Prosdor is like a hallway. Okay, well what they mean is that when the animal comes out of the womb, so if you say the head comes out of the womb, it comes immediately out of the body, and everyone will see it. Okay, there's no antechamber, thank you. Ubehema me'adam lo yalfa. Oh, sorry. So there's no prosdor for an animal. So as soon as that comes out, everyone will see. In a human, the head could come out of the womb and you won't necessarily see it. So maybe you'd say you can't learn one from the other. Maybe in the animal, because it's so obvious, we're going to consider it like a birth, but not necessarily in humans. And that's why if you had our Mishnah, you'd still need the other Mishnah. But we're really looking for the next line, which is, if you have the human Mishnah, why can't we learn from to animals? Well, that's a very interesting answer. In humans, the face is very important. The face has everything in it. Okay, right? The face is what distinguishes one from another. The face is, all your facial expressions, everything is in your face. So the face is so important in humans, less so in animals, and therefore you might have thought that's why the head coming out in a human is so significant, as if it was born, and not necessarily in animals. So therefore, we could still need both Mishnayot. But that still doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? I already told you it's not going to work, because it's v'chitema, if you want to say. Hanami Tanina, but wait, there's another Mishnah which teaches you that the head coming out in an animal is also considered a complete birth. Okay, this is a different topic, but it's also connected with animals. Shilia, if you have a placenta. Now, people would eat the placenta in an animal. So again, a placenta is like where the body, right, where the animal was. So shilia, let's say you slaughter the cow, and in it is a placenta. But if the placenta, some of it came out first, you can't eat the placenta at all if it had come out a little bit first before you slaughter the mother. Why? Just like the placenta is a sign of the life meaning the fetus is inside it, okay, in a woman. In other words, what's the concern? Okay, we're going to say it's the same in an animal. Now, what does this mean? This means that if the placenta came out a little bit of it, it could be the head was in there. So because the head was in there, it could, now this is exactly our point, even if a small amount comes out, it could be the head was in that part, right? You can't identify it when it's in the placenta, what came out, what didn't. So because the head might have come out, it's as if it was completely born and it's not permitted by the slaughter of the cow. So what do you see here? Exactly what we were trying to say our Mishnah proves. In which case, now we're going to completely reject the first answer. Our first answer was, right, that, or our answer was that it's talking about the fetus. The fetus is permitted. Why did it say hechzira? Because it really doesn't matter. The fetus will be permitted either which way, whether the leg went back in or the leg didn't go back in. Oh, it was only there for the seifa. But we now just proved the seifa is completely irrelevant, because we could learn by humans in Bechor. We learned from this other Mishnah, which will come up later in this. I think it's in this chapter even, in our Masechet. But later in our Masechet, we're going to see that other Mishnah, which clearly indicates that the head going out is like it's born. In which case, now they're going to just summarize the problem. We just proved completely that the seifa is unnecessary, the word hichzira. So the only way to explain it, that's iyamar bishlama, if you say it this way, it'll make sense, that the hechzir of the reisha is what's important, and in the seifa, the second line in the Mishnah, with the head coming out, they only used hechzira to compare it to the first part. In other words, it was a foil to case 1, instead of what we suggested, which is case 1 was a foil to case 2. We're now going to say case 2 is obviously completely unnecessary, because we could have learned it from these other two Mishnayot. In which case, it must be case 1 is what's important, the hichzira, and then case 2, it's just there because of case 1. And ela iyamar, but if you say lo reisha dafka v'lo seifa dafka, you don't need hechzira in the first case, and you don't need it in the second case. Lama li l'minei klal, then why is it there? And we're back to saying Rav really doesn't make sense, because it has to be there on purpose somewhere, and we have nowhere to explain it. Again, I just want to remind you, according to Rav, if the leg goes back in, the whole fetus, right now, he says the fetus is permitted. And it sounds like only if the leg goes back in. But that's not true, because the fetus is going to be permitted even if the leg is out. So that's why the hechzira makes no sense according to him. Okay, here comes our answer. And this, like I said, is going to be the answer for all the other questions we're going to have, because this was only difficulty number 1. Although difficulty number 1 was the most difficult of all of them. Okay. So, la'olama ubal. No, you could say mutar ba'achila is the fetus is permitted to eat, and specifically hechzira. Well, uchida amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, like Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says somewhere else. In answer number 3, we're going to get to where he actually said it, but we're going to copy and paste it to ours. which is lo nisracha ela lemakom chatach. There he said, the way he explained that one was, it's for the makom chatach. What's the makom chatach? If the animal put its arm out, its leg out, okay? I keep saying arm because yad literally translates as arm, but they have legs only. So put its foreleg out. And what happened? It was out at the time, okay, of the slaughter. You have to basically say, okay, well, the rest of the animal is permitted. The leg is not. Cut off the leg, but you have to go one step farther. It's not enough to just cut the leg. You have to cut a little bit more. Makom chatach. Where you cut it, let's say you cut it right here. So the part of the body that's right up against there that was inside, you need to cut a little more. Because it was attached to the part that was forbidden, you have to cut a little more. That's only if the arm was out. What Armish is telling us, according to Rav, this is the way we're reading it according to Rav, Hachanami, just like he answered there, that we're talking about makom chatach, also here, lo nitzcha ela lemakom chatach. What it's telling you is, what does it mean mutar b'achila? The fetus is permitted if you brought the leg back in, if the animal brought the fetus brought its leg back in, and then slaughter the mother, you can't eat the limb that was out, okay, because that's Rav. But when you cut it, because it was inside, you don't have to cut any extra. Because it was inside at the time of the slaughter, the makom chatach is not needed. That's what Rav is going to read it, that source is saying. And then we have a way to read the source according to Rav. So in the end, the chzira is there for the reisha, but it's not coming to say the fetus is permitted only if the arm goes back, if the leg goes back in. No, the fetus is permitted no matter what. It's just a matter of, right, do you have to cut extra? Okay, if you get this answer, we're going to try to fly through the next part a little bit, although you can't really fly. It's a hard task, so nothing to do about it. We're going to go through. Okay. Tashma, behema hamakshalele. This is very similar. Behema is having trouble giving birth. It's just another tannaitic source saying basically the same thing. Hotzi ubar et yado. It's a little different, but it's pretty similar. If the ubar puts out its leg, vehichzira, and brings it back in, v'achar kach shachat imo. It's the same case. Our Mishna just saying it in more words, right? And then you slaughter the mother. Mutar b'achila. It's permitted to eat. So now we're going to do the exact same thing. What's permitted, right? It's all about hichzira, and it should be permitted no matter what. And we're going to end up with makom chatach. Okay, that's the gist of where we're going. Shachat imo v'achar kach hichzira. Now, if the leg was out at the time, they slaughtered the mother. Then the fetus, the animal brought its arm back in. The fetus asul ba'achila. It can't be eaten. Okay, now. Here's where it gets tricky. What can't be eaten? Well, the fetus could be eaten. Must be the arm, right? Which means in the previous, mutar b'achila must be the arm, which is not what, right, or the leg, which is not what Rav says, right? That's going to be the whole problem here. Now we have two other lines, which are really not important. We'll try to get through them quickly. Hotzi et yada b'chatacha, v'achar kach shachatet imo. What if the arm went out, you cut it off, and then slaughtered the mother? So then, shabachutz tamei v'asur, it's worse, because then it's aver min achai, because you cut it off when the animal was still alive. So that's called aver min achai. Aver min achai is the same status of a nevela, an animal that wasn't slaughtered properly, and it has impurity. So the part that's out actually carries impurity, and it's forbidden, obviously. The shebifnim tahor mutar, and everything of the fetus that's inside is not impure at all, it's not aver min achai, and it's permitted to eat, covered by the slaughter. This is not relevant for our purposes, but we're going to read it anyway because it's here. If you slaughter the mother and then cut the arm, let's say the arm stayed out the whole time. You slaughter the mother, then cut the arm off. Turning now to Amabet, habasal maganevela. Well, the basar is considered the status of impurity a little bit less than a nevela. It's like something that touched a nevela. Divrei Rabbi Meir. And Chachamim omrim magat treifa shchuta. He lowers it even more. It's only like an impurity by rabbinic law. It's as if it touched a treifa, which is really not impure, but the rabbis deemed it impure. Okay, that's a side point. We're going to move on. Now, here comes the difficulty, as you could probably guess. Katani miya reisha, but from the reisha it says, Hotziu barit yado v'chzirav, achar kach shachatet imo mutar b'achila. So again, that first line, if it brought it back in, then it's permitted. My lava aver. Aren't they talking about if you brought it back in, then the limb is permitted, the leg? Lo, aubar. No, it's talking about the fetus, the whole fetus. So again, back to our question. Iubar ema seifa. It doesn't work with the second line then to say the fetus because one says it's permitted, the other says it's forbidden. They're obviously talking about the same thing. And look at that next line. Try to substitute fetus. It doesn't work. Shachatet imo. Again, we read this already. If you slaughter the mother, achar kach ichziro, then you brought it back in. Asur b'achila. Now, if the fetus, right, brings back its arm after the mother was slaughtered, then obviously it's forbidden. What's forbidden? The limb, not the ubar. The ubar was inside the whole time when it was slaughtered. Obviously the ubar is permitted. So ubar, mayasul. If we were talking about the fetus, why would it be forbidden? And then that doesn't fit according to Rav. So we're trying to put mutal in the beginning is fetus, and then asur is the fetus, and that's just not true. So again, they're going to answer, same answer as before. Just like Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said somewhere else, that it's talking about when it means mutar without having to cut off any extra. Okay? And asur b'achila means you have to cut off extra. In other words, again, it all depends. If the arm was out at the time of the slaughter, you're going to have to not only say the arm is not kosher, but even part of the fetus that was right next to it, right adjacent to it. And mutar b'achila, and then it's all on the fetus. Mutar b'achila is the fetus, even with the makom chatach, you don't have to get rid of it because the arm had been brought back, the leg had been brought back in. Okay, so that's how we explain source number 2. And like I said, is how we're going to explain source number 3. Source number 3 is going to be actually where Rav Nachman said it. Okay, so ini, is this really true? But again, we're going to have another difficulty. Haki ata avimi, when Avimi came from Mibechozai, which was a very far away place, if you remember, we had some stories there. Someone returning, getting their money back from there. Anyway, ata va'aita banita biyadi. He brought a braita with him that I guess they had never seen before. That's the whole idea. Now, it goes back to that pasuk, kol b'be'ema tochelu, that we said be'ema b'be'ema, where we learned this whole law of a ben pekua. It also says something else twice. It says mafreset parsa, v'shosat shesa shtei prasot. So it says parsa and it says prasot, right? These are the hooves. So now, remember, it needs split hooves. It's split all the way down the middle. So the drasha goes like this. Parsa hichzir echol. Prasot hichzir echol. Now, let's say you had 2 of the limbs out, okay, 2 of the legs, and then you brought one in, or 2 of the hooves out, and then you brought one back in, you can eat it. If you bring both of them back in, that's the prasot, you can eat it. Okay, this is presumably telling us 2 new halachot, right? That if one of them is brought in, you can eat that one. If both of them are brought in, you can eat that one. Now, my lav hichzir parsa echol parsa, lo hichzir parsa echol ubal. Now, doesn't it mean if you returned the hoof back inside, if the fetus brought it back inside before it was slaughtered, then you can eat the hoof. Lo hichzir parsa, right? What if it didn't? Oh, so right. So then they say, sorry, I didn't read that well, right? Doesn't it mean hichzir parsa echol parsa, which means you can eat the limb, which goes against Rav? So they say, no. Hichzir parsa echol ubal. No, you read it as if you brought the limb back in, the hoof back in, then you can eat the fetus. Okay? And that fits with Rav. Again, the Gemara is going to ask, it doesn't depend on whether you bring it back in or not. We keep having the same question over and over. Iubar ma'ir yachzir, afilu lo chzir nami. Right? If it's the fetus, what's the difference if you brought it in, didn't bring it in? The fetus is permitted no matter what. And here's where Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said it. I'm Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, lo nitzcha ela lemakom chatach. No, what it's trying to teach you is the makom chatach. And it's trying to tell you, right? Now, you think we're going to end here, but we're not. Okay, but theoretically we should end right here, which is, how do we explain it? Parsa hichzir echol. Prasot hichzir echol. What does it mean? If the limbs are brought back in, then, right, whether one or whether you brought both of them back in, okay, at that point, you're not allowed to eat the ones that went out, but you don't have to cut any extra, right, of the fetus. If they were left out, then you're going to have to cut the limb off and a little bit more. And that's what it's teaching us. Now, maybe you can figure out the problem. The problem with answering this here is v'hatre krai kanasifle. But wait, then why do you need parsa and prasot? It's one and the same, whether it's one limb or it's 2 limbs, right? And you brought back one. It doesn't matter. If you brought them both back in, you brought one of them in. Either which way, the halacha is the exact same thing. So they were basically saying if you have one that teaches you parsa, sir parsa chol ubar, sir parsot chol ubar, it's teaching you the exact same thing. So right, and you can eat the makom chatach, right? My lav, it must be, if there's 2 drashot here, each one must be coming to teach you something else. Chad la'ever v'chad la'makom chatach. In other words, I'll grant you that it's talking about makom chatach, but only one of them. The other one must be telling you that if you bring the limb back in, actually even the limb is permitted. So they say, Lo, I'll give you a different answer. Because again, that answer leaves us with a difficulty with Rav, because Rav says you can't eat the limb. So they wanted to say, no, it doesn't work. There's no reason for 2 drashot. Well, now we're going to go very far off and say the second reference is actually not talking about bringing it back in and what's permitted, what's not permitted. It's talking about something else entirely. Okay? So, lo. Chad l'makom chatach. One is for the makom chatach. And chad l'kalut b'me'ei para. So the one that says prasot tichzir echol, we're going to understand that is, if you brought in both hooves, you can eat the fetus, and you don't have to cut off the extra part. You obviously have to cut off the 2 limbs, the 2 legs, but you don't have to cut off any more than that. Now, or the 2 hooves. The second one, really, which is the first one, which is parsa. Now, again, it doesn't really fit into the words, so bear with that. Parsa yichzir echol. If you return the parsa, you can eat it. It's not really hichzir. The hichzir is not there for any good reason. Okay? Chad kalut b'me'ei para. This is coming to teach you a completely different halacha. What's parsa? Well, prasot, when it's split, there's like 2 prasot. It's 1 hoof that's kind of split in half. That's split hooves. That's the kosher split hooves. If it's only partially split, it's not kosher. Now they come to teach you a really interesting halacha. I don't know, interesting, but different. What if you have a cow, which is clearly a kosher animal, and it gives birth to an animal that has its kalut. Kalut means its hooves aren't split all the way. It's more like parsa, 1 parsa. It's 1 hoof, right, that's not completely split down into 2. Now, that's not kosher, that animal, because that animal doesn't have split hooves. However, if you slaughter a cow and inside you find a fetus, this is going to be called kalut. Kalut is when it doesn't have the split hooves all the way down. It's kalut b'me'ei para, in utero. Okay, so you slaughter the para, you open it up inside, and what do you see? That the fetus inside doesn't have completely split hooves. Guess what? It's kosher according to Rabbi Shimon. And that's what the parsa, again, it's weird because it says hichzir, which has nothing to do with hichzir. But parsa echol, they basically want to say, if it has 1 parsa when it's in utero, you can eat it. That's the chidush here. And only, obviously, according to Rabbi Shimon, because Rabbi Shimon is the one who says this is okay. Rabbi Shimon, kalup ben para asur, if it's kalup born to a para, it's forbidden, but hanimile hechad yatzala avir ha'olam. But that's only if it was born. But b'me'emo, if it's still in utero, shari, it's permitted. Okay? And then we've resolved it all. So each of these 3 sources that we thought was saying that if it brings it back in, you can eat the limb. No, you can't eat the limb. What it's teaching you is if it brings it back inside, you don't have to cut the makom chatach, the place where that forbidden part met the permitted part. You don't have to cut a little extra there. That's what it's trying to tell you, and we've resolved all 3 questions. Now we get to Ula. Ula Amar Rabbi Yochanan, ve'ever atzmo mutar. Ula says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, here's the counter opinion, the limb itself is permitted. If the limb went back in and was inside at the time of the slaughter, it's permitted. And that actually is the more intuitive way to read the Mishna, as we saw, because every time we had a problem, we had to explain it some other way. Amarle Rav Yehuda Lula becomes Rav Yehuda, who was a student of Rav and also a student of Shmuel. When Rav died, and he's the one who quoted Rav as saying this, he goes to Ula and he says, "V'ha Rav Shmuel da'amrit Travayu ever atzmo asur." But what do you do with Rav? Rav says it's forbidden. Amarle, he says to Rav Yehuda, "Man yahivlan me'afra de Rav Shmuel malinan einan." Okay, this is a big line. It's quoted a bunch of times in Shas. Wow, halavai, I wish I could, they're not alive anymore. I wish I could have the ashes from the dust of their bones or whatever, their bodies, decompose this. I would put it in my eyes, and my eyes would be, brighter. Meaning, I have such respect for the 2 of them. By the way, note that also Shmuel holds like Rav. We didn't know that before. Okay, we only saw Rav. Now we have Shmuel. Ella, but with all due respect, it's a basic way of saying, I'm a Rabbi Yochanan. Hakol, okay, but I go with Rabbi Yochanan. And what did Rabbi Yochanan say? Hakol hayu bichlal basar b'sedet chefa lo tochelu. Now, while I'll admit with you that it did seem like he was right, that basar b'sedet chefa is referring to everything. Anything that left its place and comes back is as if it's disqualified, right? It's out. It's been out already. However, that would have been true if we just had that verse. But כשפירט לך כתוב גבי חטאת שיצא חוץ למחיצתה וחזרה אסורה. But there's one case in the Torah where they specify this halacha by the sin offering. And then he's going to basically say, I'll show you where in a minute, Chatatu de parat rachman haba. So that teaches you that because they were very specific and said this applies in a chatat, that once it goes out, it can't go back in and it's forbidden. Aval kol mili, but anything else, kevan dehadro shari. By the Torah talking about in one specific case means it's only in that specific case, and this principle doesn't apply anywhere else. And that's why I disagree with Rav. Where does it come up? You remember the famous story, we've come across this a bunch of times in the Gemara, with Moshe goes to Aaron on the day of the sanctification, on the 8th day of the Miluim, after his sons have died, and he gets angry at him, and he says, why did you burn the sin offering, right? Why didn't you eat it? And then he said, right, I don't understand why you burnt it, right? You didn't bring its blood inside, okay? Meaning, this chatat, you shouldn't bring the blood inside. The heichal, you didn't bring it inside. But they use this extra word, pnima, inside. Now, it could have just said, you didn't bring it to the kodesh. It says, kodesh pnima. Now, kodesh is obviously inside. So why do you need kodesh pnima? They learn from there that pnima means you also didn't take it, it's supposed to be inside and you didn't take it outside. And had you taken it outside, you would have had to burn it because there's nothing else to do with it. That's where it specifies just by the sin offering. And from there we learn it's only by the sin offering. That's Rabbi Yochanan's position. It's not true anywhere else if it leaves, so not true by our case as well. Okay, now we're going to bring a difficulty on this. Why does it say it here? Now they say, wait, is there because what? Okay, now these have to be eaten in Jerusalem, the first fruits and the second tithes. Even though they're taken out of Jerusalem and brought back in, you can still eat them. They don't get disqualified by being taken out. Yachol af zekain. You might have thought maybe everything else. Talmud lomar trefa. Okay, from the word trefa, you learn everything else that's taken out of its place is a problem. So the Gemara says, my Talmud, where do you get it from the word trefa? I'm a Rebbe, kit trefa. Ma trefa kevan sheni trefa. Shuv ein la heter. What's unique about a trefa? Once it's a trefa and the animal's sick, and then you slaughter it, there's nothing you can do. It's never going to be kosher. Af basar kevan she'yatza chutz l'mchitzato shuv ein lo heter. Once the meat goes out of its place, there's no way to resolve it. So now, right, this seems to say this applies across the board. It would apply in our case as well against Rabbi Yochanan. To which they say, tiyuvta de'ula tiyuvta. This difficulty that he raised against Ula about Rabbi Yochanan's position is really difficult. Now we just have a side point. Amar Mar, in this Braita we just read, Lafisha Matzinu Ma'aser Sheni Bikurim Hecha Matzinu. Where do we know what they thought was so obvious, that Bikurim and Ma'aser Sheni that leaves Jerusalem and goes back in is fine? Well, Dichtiv Lo Tucha Lecho B'Sharecha Ma'aser Tegancha. Right, you can't eat in your gates. What does that mean? You have to eat it in Jerusalem, not in your gates. Well, because it says B'Sharecha Hu Delo Techal. In your gates, you can't eat them. Aval Yatzu Chutz L'Mchitzatam V'Chazru Mutalin. It makes it sound like as long as it's in Jerusalem, it doesn't matter whether it left and came back in. As long as it's in Jerusalem, you can eat it. As long as you're not in your own gates. Okay? And that's where they get it. Now, we're going to end the daf with this. Okay? And then we're running pretty late, so we'll stop here. B'ma'arava matnu hachi. In Israel, they had a different version of the machloket. So basically, if we have to summarize this daf, we'll summarize right now, and then we'll end with this point. Even though it was a bit of a complicated, or quite a complicated daf, we basically had these two approaches, Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. Rav said, if a limb goes out, that's it. It's done. It can never be kosher. Okay? Even if it goes back in at the time of the slaughter, it's not permitted. Rabbi Yochanan says, no. If it came back in, it's permitted. If it didn't, then not. Okay? That was a quick summary of the whole daf. Now we're going to see the same machloket in Israel. The way they taught this version of the machloket in Israel was in a different language. And then we're going to talk about one relevant change in the language. And then we're going to start tomorrow with the question about that. Okay? Rav Amal, Yesh leida le'evarim, for Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Ein leida le'evarim. There's something called birth with limbs. Limbs can be born, and that means limbs can be born that once they go out, they're as if they're born. Okay? Rabbi Yochanan says limbs can't be born. There's no birth by limbs. Okay? And that's the same idea. My benai, what's the difference whether you say it the way they said it in Israel like this, or you say it the way they said it by us? Ika benayu lemeisar miut ever shebifnim. The nafkamina is going to be like this. Okay, and with this will end. If you say there's birth by Evarim, then the way it works with birth is if the majority comes out, then it's as if the whole thing came out. So if we say leg came out. Now, until now, we assume part of the leg came out, or it could have been part of the leg. And then whatever was out is out, whatever was in was in. But if you say there's birth by limbs, and that was Rav's position, right? If Rav said once it went out, it's done deal. Okay, you bring it back in, it doesn't matter. Whatever part went out, you have to cut off. If you say yesh lidale ivarim, you mean there's birth by ivarim, which means if 3/4 of the leg came out and went back in, the whole leg is not kosher because it's as if the whole limb came out. Okay, so once you hit majority, the rest of it is going to go with the majority of that limb, and that would be Rav would be even more stringent in the second version. Okay, we'll stop here and we'll get to the question. That's going to be a question of Rabbi Yochanan according to that. With that, we finish today's daf. Wishing everyone a good day. And don't forget that there's a study guide, and that will help organize the whole first part. The study guide goes all through Rav's position, okay? The 3 difficulties on Rav, and the resolutions, and the back and forth in between. So it's kind of indented to see like what, with 1 difficulty, 2, the difficulty, what part of the Gemara is coming for which element. Okay? With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.